From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, September 13th. We've been hearing for a while now about how China is making moves consistent with its intention to become a global power, to rival the United States. How it's beefing up its military arsenal and claiming sovereignty over more and more areas in the South China Sea, which other countries say belong to them. But if this is the case, why did China's president, Xi Jinping, ditch one of the most important yearly summits with other global leaders over the weekend? Today, international and political editor Peter Hartcher on what Xi Jinping was up to instead, and whether his activities signal an increasing likelihood of a new Cold War between the United States and China. So, Peter, China made headlines last week when it snubbed the G20 summit, opting not to attend the meeting in India over the weekend. Now, there's a number of summits in our region, each with fairly forgettable acronyms. So why should we care about the G20 and the fact that Xi Jinping deemed it wasn't worth his time?
Okay, why should we care? Well, maybe we shouldn't. No, I'm just kidding. The G20 was created to coordinate a global economic response after the world economy was in free fall in the global financial crisis. Australia's very own Kevin Rudd was instrumental in pulling it together with the host Gordon Brown. And it did a great job. It arrested the collapse. Since then, it's floundered a bit looking for a cause. But if you are worried about the fracturing in the world economy and the protectionism that is underway, and more importantly, if you are worried about the tension between the great powers and especially the increasingly warlike rhetoric and tendencies between China and the US, then you'd want to support an effort that brought the countries together in the same room and gave them an opportunity to talk, to maybe see that each is not the demon that the other likes to portray in their popular discourse at home. You're right, Xi Jinping did skip the G20, which sent a signal that he didn't really care, that he didn't want to either meet Joe Biden or any of the other leaders, but he did send his deputy, the Premier of China, Li Qiang, was there.
So what was Xi Jinping doing instead?
Yes, it did occur to me, I wonder what pressing priority he's got at home that took him away from the G20. So I followed his movements, and on Thursday, when the first of the major summits, the East Asia Summit, was happening in Jakarta, he went to northeastern China and made a tour of a flood-affected area and made a particular point of walking through rice paddies and inspecting the rice crop. But it was what he said to the assembled officials, local officials, but also members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the 7-man committee that runs the country at the highest level. And at that meeting, he said that we must put food self-sufficiency at the very top of our national priorities, that you, the local officials, have to ensure that there is a reliable supply of grain, even in the case of extreme scenarios. And it was, of course, transmitted across all of the party-owned media in China and broadcast nationally. That sent a big signal about what he's planning, what he's thinking, and where China is heading.
So what does this tell us about what Xi Jinping is thinking? Why is he so focused on food security?
Yeah, it's peculiar, isn't it? Because China abandoned attempts at socialist isolation 50 years ago under Deng Xiaoping and has traded with the world, and that has been one of the reasons for its startling economic success. So why would you want to meddle with that? The reason is it's contained in Xi Jinping's own rhetoric. He talks about extreme scenarios, extreme circumstances, and increasingly worst-case scenario. And we've seen this elevated in the official discourse since he first used it at a major national security meeting in May. And what he's talking about is war. He's telling the country to brace itself for armed conflict with the US. And in those circumstances, he's envisaging a moment where China will not be able to buy food from the world. Therefore, it'll have to fall back on its own resources. And that is a problem.
So on that problem, Xi Jinping has ordered that urban sites in China, like shops and factories, be turned into fields to produce these crops. And yet you've written that a reporter from the Financial Times recently visited more than a dozen of these new fields, and what he found was something of a surprise.
Yes, so China's food self-sufficiency in the year 2000 was 100%. Today, it's down around 3/4. So that's a pretty precipitous fall. And while the grain supply is pretty good, it's the rest of the food supply that Chinese people have got to worry about. So Xi Jinping, trying to get this ratio up, has issued instructions that you must increase acreage, you must increase the volume of crops grown, particularly soybean and corn, against the day when, as I said, he envisages China to be cut off from global trade beyond the Eurasian landmass. And of course, being in effect, an absolute dictator with nobody to counsel him otherwise, he's issuing these edicts and they're getting carried out sometimes in some extreme or silly or unproductive ways. So a lot of land is being switched from more productive uses to growing soybeans. And the case study that you mentioned was in the city of Chengdu, where a reporter went to have a look and saw a bunch of fields that had been shopping centres and saw instead that they were now sown with soybean, but pretty badly sown, sparsely sown. The fields were full of weeds. And the reporter for the Financial Times of London quoted a local official in Chengdu city saying, we don't really care about the output, that's not important. We're just showing support, that we support the policy. So this is political kowtowing to the emperor in Beijing. It's not actually caring about or seriously trying to grow more crops. And there's a labour shortage of people willing to go and work on farms. Young people won't do the work. They're getting old guys to do it. Often they have to bus them in from the cities and the returns are low, the pay is terrible, and they've got more profitable things to do. So they're struggling. So that's just a snapshot into the difficulties of translating what looks like a pretty sensible top-level policy in Beijing to an on-the-ground success in actually delivering loads of new grain.
And you've highlighted some very interesting historical context, I guess, to when China last instituted policies like this, like in the 1950s with Mao's Great Leap Forward. Can you explain a little bit, I guess, what happened then in terms of what this might foreshadow for China's future?
The Great Leap Forward was Mao's great strategy to reinvent China or recreate China as a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse. And part of that was to develop agriculture dramatically. And he set completely unrealistic targets for the provinces to deliver in terms of their crop output. And the result was that the provinces, they didn't want to disappoint the emperor, Mao Zedong, in Beijing. So they simply faked it. They made up fake stories of their successes. They made up fake statistics about the crop harvests. They did really silly things. And it ended up in the worst famine the world has ever seen. Minimum dead were 30 million, made world wars look trivial by comparison. And while post-Mao China did edge away from pretending it was all a great success, the current leader, Xi Jinping, because he is an acolyte and a fan of Mao, has now banned criticism of Mao's mistakes, including criticism of the so-called Great Leap Forward.
And so we know that China may be preparing for war, and therefore the country is bulking up this food supplies, or at least attempting to. But if the crops are not sustainable and China does sever ties with key exporters, isn't relying on its own food supply a major hindrance? That is, couldn't this mean starving its own people, including its soldiers?
So a lot of the Xi Jinping rhetoric is about preparing for a long-term struggle and long-term crises. So he's expecting the country will be cut off from a lot of food imports for a long time. And you're right, what they would have to fall back on would be, although they have a high self-sufficiency output of grain, they have a much more inadequate supply with most other things, meat, sugar, oilseeds, dairy, for example. So the people of China would be forced onto subsistence rations, presumably for a long time, and it would be very difficult, very uncomfortable, and may make Xi Jinping very unpopular. But in the rhetoric, he's preparing people for this, and he talks about, and has for years talked about, happiness through struggle.
And just with regards to the relations between China and the United States and what seems to be building or an increasingly acrimonious relationship, Joe Biden announced on the weekend that he did not want a new Cold War with China. But does China's focus on self-sufficiency and Xi Jinping's rejection of the G20 and other summits just recently signify that China perhaps is thinking quite the opposite, that Xi Jinping would quite welcome a Cold War with the US?
Well, as you know, a succession of US military officers has predicted, as an Air Force general in January predicted that Xi Jinping could go to war to seize Taiwan by 2025. And there have been reports out of China that Xi Jinping himself has told his military commanders to be prepared for warfare by 2027. So this is now broadly accepted in the strategic communities and the defence communities of most of the world that there will be a contest, there will be a showdown.
I am sincere about getting the relationship right. And one of the things that is going on now is China is beginning to change some of the rules of the game in terms of trade and other issues.
Joe Biden, who attended the G20 summit, did tell the media that he wasn't seeking to, quote, hurt China, unquote, that he wasn't looking for a Cold War.
As I said, we're not looking to hurt China, sincerely. We're all better off if China does well. China does well by the international rules.
So, led by the US and its alliance bloc, which contains more than 40 countries, including Australia, of course. Countries are moving towards setting up deterrence to try to deter China from this course.
I'm not going to sell China material that would enhance their capacity to make more nuclear weapons, to engage in defense activities that are...
You know, Putin woke them up that it's not just, this stuff isn't just rhetoric from dictators, that they can actually translate it into attacks and invasion and war of a sort we thought had long vanished from this earth. And they are now moving to try to deter China to do the same thing. That's what AUKUS was part of. That's what a lot of the manoeuvrings you see around the world are part of. So I think we're already probably, depends on how you define it, I think we're probably already into a Cold War if you look at the increasing barriers that China and the US are putting up against each other. As to whether it gets into hot war, that's where we really have to worry, and that's where all these efforts towards deterrence are now leading.
And on that point, what do you think the chance is that China is now looking to what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and how that war is going, and that might actually chasten any ambition or ideas that, perhaps we should put this theory into practice?
Well, there's a lot of hopeful thinking, maybe wishful thinking in the West that is exactly what is happening, that Xi Jinping, like Vladimir Putin, is surprised at the speed and solidarity of the Western alliance bloc's responses to the invasion of Ukraine. But if Xi Jinping isn't deterred, if he is determined, and only Xi Jinping can know that, then it will instead give him first some pointers to what he could expect if he were in fact to launch military action, whether it's over Taiwan, over the Senkaku Islands in Japan, which the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands, or whether it's in the South China Sea. He may use that as a bit of an instruction manual on what the Allies would do and therefore give him a bit of a map on how to counter it. It also creates opportunities, of course, because when the military stockpiles of NATO, including, of course, the US, are being drawn down at a furious rate in order to keep Ukraine supplied, that creates shortages in weaponry and hardware, and that may play to the advantage of a country thinking of launching a war in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Yeah, once again, I wish it could be a happier topic, but good to chat to you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel and Tammy Mills, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au www.pleaseexplain.com/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.